In the previous video, we started talking about modules in general. Now let's start talking about networking modules in particular. Let's start using some modules that connect to networking devices and start gathering information using those. So we'll start by using a couple of Cisco modules. These are actually modules that are built into Ansible core as of Ansible 2. Most of these are as of, or some of these are as of Ansible 2.1, some of them are as of Ansible 2.2. At the time I'm doing this recording, we're using Ansible 2.2 on the system. So let's start using this iOS underscore facts module. Now, it is frequently helpful to look at some of the documentation for the modules and to look at an example of what the module arguments are. So here we can sort of see a little bit of information about it. Let's go ahead and start constructing a playbook that uses this module. So we'll do iOS example.yaml. We'll start it out with our 3 hashes. We'll start creating our play, which remember our play is a YAML list entry. We'll give it some name field. We'll call this iOS facts. I'll call it iOS example. Now we're going to say which hosts we're going to operate on. We're going to operate on the Cisco group. If we go back and look at our Ansible hosts file, you'll notice we have a Cisco group. It has two Cisco routers. Here's their IP address. That's using this Ansible host variable. It has a username and password. There also is, for all of the variables, there's this Ansible connection local, and there's this Ansible Python interpreter. Now notice here this is using MyPython. In your lab environment, this will be using your Python in your virtual environment. Okay, so we go back in here. We're going to use the Cisco group. We're going to use the tasks. We're going to call this iOS facts module, and now we need our arguments in here. And here's where we can start grabbing a couple of the examples in the documentation and figure out how we need to construct this. So now one thing these Ansible 2.1 built-in core networking modules do is a lot of times they use this thing called a provider. And let's look at using an example of that. So we're going to make this variable. So we're going to add a variable to our playbook. We're going to give this variable some name. I'm going to call this variable credentials. Now that variable is going to specify certain things. We don't need the transport. The iOS underscore modules are by default going to use SSH. So we're using Ansible connection local. That's going to ship the module back to the control machine. Inside the iOS facts module, it's going to make an SSH connection to the remote device. We do need to pass in the host, so which host name or IP address we're connecting to. We also need to pass in the username and password. Now, if we were operating on a single device like Pynet router 1, we could do something like the following. We could literally say the IP address here. We could say our username and password here. Now, how would I refer to this variable? Now notice this is the dictionary. I would use this provider argument, and I would specify the name of my variable. Here I'm going to call it creds. And now let's go ahead and see if we can execute that and whether it works properly or not. So we do Ansible playbook, iOS example -.yaml. I'm going to execute it on my Ansible host file. Now I have some error here. And let's look at what it doesn't like. Okay, so it's giving me an error that says somewhere near the top, I don't like what you're doing here with this name iOS example. So let's go see if we see anything that's wrong with our playbook. So we have the name, Let's check our alignment. Now, one error I see that I made is the tasks is actually supposed to be a list entry. So that's one error that I made. So tasks is supposed to be a list entry and not supposed to be just a straight string. So let's go ahead and make that change. And that was our error. So you can sort of see here that this error string that Ansible gave us wasn't super helpful because it was pointing at the play, but when the issue was something that was inside the play that was broken. Now let's go ahead and add the -v argument and see if we're getting anything back from the facts that are useful. Okay, so you can see we're getting some information back, and let's expand this to -vvv and see if we can get some more details on the facts that we're getting back. Okay, so we're getting some things like here's the OS version, here's the serial number of that device, here's some LLDP information, so it's connected to an HP switch on port 15. The model number, this is in fact an 881. Some interface information. Here we see its IPv4 address. It doesn't have an IPv6 address, and here's its file system, which is using the /: file system. Now, in this case, I didn't actually use the inventory information. I hard-coded the addresses. And this would work for PyNet Router 1, but what if I change this to the Cisco group? In the case of the Cisco group, the username and the password would stay the same, but the IP address would need to change. So let's start pulling this information. Instead of hard-coding it from the file, let's pull it from our inventory. So this is going to be the Ansible host variable. This is going to be our username variable. This is going to be our password variable. Go back and look at our Ansible host file. Here's the Ansible host we're using, and here's our username and password variables. Now let's try to rerun this playbook, but let's use it against both of the Cisco switches. Okay. Expand this to -vvv to make it easier to read as far as the output. Okay, so now we look at this, and here's .70. And let's see if we see something that has the second router. And then here's the .71. And then here you see it's PyNet Router 2. And you can see at the bottom it executed against both PyNet Router 1 and PyNet Router 2. Now let's grab one of these variables. Oh, let's grab like this net model variable. So these iOS facts are automatically registered as facts, which means I can directly use these variables in my playbook. So if I call the debug, I can actually directly reference the variable. So here I'm going to use the var argument and just call Ansible net module. And let's see if we have Ansible _net model. And let's run our new playbook now. So there it's gathering facts with the iOS facts. Here you see I'm printing out the debug, and here you see that it's found this model for both of them. So you see we've gathered these facts from the remote networking devices. Now let me start showing you a couple of additional arguments we could use here. The playbook has a limit argument, and you can use the limit to say I only want to run this playbook on a subset of my specified devices. So here I'm going to say I want to run this playbook only on, limited to, PyNet Router 2. And there you can see we're only executing this playbook on PyNet Router 2. Now you can also add something called tags. And tags are a way to control which sections of your playbook get executed. So here I'm going to add a tag called facts only. And when I run my playbook, if I specify the tags facts only, it's only going to run those tasks that have that tag. So in this case, here we see the setup, here we see the iOS facts, but you didn't see the debug happen. So if I drop the tags, you'll not only see all of what you saw here, but you'd see the debug task execute as well. Okay, so here we're starting to build this Cisco iOS specific playbook. Let's go ahead and add one more thing to our playbook. Now we're going to use a different module. This won't be the iOS underscore facts playbook. It's going to be the iOS underscore command playbook. Once again, we're going to use our provider because we need the host username and password for the login information. Now, the iOS command module takes another argument. It's this commands argument, and here you can specify iOS commands to run. So we'll run the show IP int brief command, and we'll go ahead and execute that and see what we get for output. Okay, so here we're running iOS facts, here we're running the debugging, and then here it ran the iOS command. Now let's go ahead and add our verbose to see what happens with iOS command. So here you see we got our show IP int brief back. The line wrapped it a little bit, but here you can see the show IP int brief. We scroll up, we'll see show IP int brief from PyNet router 2. So we accomplished our show IP int brief. We're gathering both facts and we're executing a show command. Now, what if we wanted to save this output to a variable? So at this point we have that output back, but we haven't saved it anyway. Let's start looking at expanding our playbook to save this to a variable. The way we do this is we use the register keyword. Now notice this is not an argument to iOS command, so it's not indented inside iOS command. It's at the same level as the task, so at the same level as the module colon. Here we specify register, which is we're going to save this output to a variable, and we'll just save it to a variable known as output. And then we'll go ahead and use our debug and say print out the output variable. Go ahead and run our module. Here we have the setup going, here we have the facts going, there's our debugging, and then here we print out our output. Now notice, and this is a little bit hard to see here, here's our output getting printed out. And if you look at this highest level structure we're getting back, is we're actually getting back a dictionary. You can see that with this curly brace. And here you see the first key, which is output. And inside output, you see that we have this dictionary. And it has a changed key. It has a standard out key. It has standard out underscore lines key. And then finally it has this warnings key. So now let's try to dig into this returned data structure and only grab standard out underscore lines. So let's go ahead and change this to be not debugging on straight the variable, but let's look inside this variable. So we'll change this to the message colon, and let's look at this inside of this. Now, you can write this the same way you would write Python. So you could do, I want to look inside this dictionary, which is output. I'm going to look for a key called standard out underscore lines and print that out instead. And let's rerun this playbook. So we're just drilling into the returned data structure. So key thing to remember here is we're using register to save the output from this. That saves it into a variable known as output. Then we're trying to drill into this returned data structure because it has more things that we want. It has additional things than just the straight output from the router, and we want to peel back those things to only save the thing, to only look at the thing we want to look at. So here we said, look at output, give me the key standard out underscore lines. So you can write it the same way you wrote it as Python, but you can also write it as dot notation. So you can also write it this way as well. Output, give me the key standard out underscore lines. Let's run it that way just to show you that those two are equivalent. Now if you look at this output we're getting back here, so here's the message we're printing out for PyNet Router 2, and you look at this and you actually see it's wrapped inside a list, and in fact there's another list inside there, and this list is a list of all the lines. So here's line 0 for the list element, element 1, element 2, element 3, element 4. But let's get rid of this outermost list wrapping. Let's eliminate that outermost list wrapping. How do we do that? We just access the list element. In this case, it only has one element. That's element 0. So let's just get rid of that outermost list wrapping, so we're looking inside and look at element 0. So once again, we're just trying to peel back layer by layer this output data structure we're getting back so that we can see it in an easier fashion. And let's execute that playbook. And here you go. Now you see we only have a single list, and here's all its elements. If we wanted to look at a particular element, we could just access, say for example, we wanted to access element 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We could just get this element, and we could just expand on our playbook to only access that list element. And let's run this and see what that looks like. So we're just peeling back the data structure to only look at specific things. In here we see that one line is coming back. Now, let's go and review our playbook. So here's our playbook structure. We're writing it in YAML. We have a single play. All this is our single play. Remember, this is a list element in YAML. If we wanted to add a second play, we'd start down here and add, a highest most list structure and say what we wanted to say and start specifying, which host we wanted to execute the second play on. Like so, for example, if we said we want to operate this one on Arista, and then the tasks that we wanted to do there. But here we only have a single play. We specify a variable directly inside this play. We specify which devices in inventory we're going to operate on, and then we specify all the tasks that we're going to do. Here we're using the iOS fax module to go and grab fax on the devices. Here we're printing out one of those fax we gathered, this Ansible _net _model. Then we're going to execute the iOS _command module. Once again, we're providing it its username, password, some Cisco command we want to execute. Then we're going to save the output using this register. We're going to save the output from that command into a variable known as output. And then we start trying to inspect what we get back in that variable, trying to strip back the layers of that to only get the information that we want to get.